So delighted to have been joined by Matthew Mckinnon from DARA, and you've put together a climate vulnerability monitor report, which is gives an idea of the impacts of climate change we're seeing today. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's basically a lot of people think that climate change is something that happens in the future and something that's not happening to people. And we basically created what we call as the monitor, which is to zero in on the impact that is actually happening today and keep watch on it, and also see how it's changing in the future, and it's rapidly accelerating. We look at 190 almost countries around the world, and we look at how different things like impacts on human health, desertification, sea level rise, stress on the economy affects all the different countries in different ways. And what we see is that the scale of the crisis already today is massive, and in particular there's a human toll of climate change, which is some 350,000 people every single year already today. That's mainly because climate change affects the way that certain infectious diseases are spread and certain health problems that you often see in developing countries, but not very often in wealthy places, because things like malaria have been eradicated there, but these diseases already kill more than 5 million people in developing countries, and climate change aggravates this. So as a result, several 100,000 additional people are dying, and what we see in particular is that the change that's going to happen over the next 20 to 30 years is going to be much more rapid than what we've seen in the past few years. You know, every decade is getting warmer. It's going to get warmer by much more. The last 100 years of climate change is going to be roughly repeated in the next 20 to 30 years alone. So the extra stress is huge, and 350,000 deaths will become almost 1 million deaths by 2030 every year if we don't take steps to adapt to climate change. So to limit the types of effects that, like temperature increase and how they affect diseases and in all other areas of climate change.
And you've said that these impacts are being felt mainly in the developing world rather than in rich countries.
Yeah.
How are they distributed around the world, though?
The worst affected countries are basically in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and small island states in the Pacific, some in the Caribbean. You do see impacts in wealthy countries as well, in particular economic impacts. I mean, half of the total damages caused by and losses caused by climate change affect industrialized countries alone. And the United States is one of the worst affected countries among the wealthy countries. And actually, it turns out we have these things we call hotspots, which are top 10 countries by total impact in different areas, and the United States pops up in 4 or 5 of them. So it's, desertification is an issue in the United States, sea level rise, but it's clear that most of the problem is happening in low-income countries, and in particular in sub-Saharan Africa you have multiple stresses happening. You've got issues related to health. Some countries are experiencing even both sea level rise and desertification. Small island states are a big issue because the very low-lying islands, Maldives, for instance, is pretty much below 2 meters in height, the entire country. So even like 10 centimeters of sea level rise that we see roughly every decade or so is a major issue, because there's just not enough land there. And they're also facing, in the tropics, you have warmer seas, more acidic oceans. This is causing coral to bleach, to die, basically. Most coral exists up to a temperature of 30 degrees in the water, and if it goes above that, it just dies, and it dies very rapidly. And so there's coral bleaching going on all over the world. And if temperatures rise a little bit more, which they will do anyway, because we can't prevent warming that's already in the system, the reefs of the world will change or disappear. They'll become gardens of seaweed, and it's something that is irreversible, that we can't really change.
And what's the breadth of these impacts? You've mentioned health, you've mentioned ocean acidification and a bleaching of coral reefs. What other kinds of impacts are people really going to notice?
Well, I mean, the thing is, people are noticing all sorts of changes. I mean, one interesting thing is our report shows the UK as being particularly not vulnerable, whereas a lot of people have seen that weather is becoming more erratic, more extreme. There's been flooding that has never occurred before, and you know, these are significant changes that are taking place, and people notice them. But the vulnerability of a place like the UK is much lower compared to that of a place like Bangladesh or the Maldives or a lot of African countries, Mali, countries in the Sahel on the borders of the Sahara Desert. Those countries are going to feel impacts that are so severe across the board that whether it's in health, whether it's in terms of basically losing land because it's degrading into desert. And I mean, you have temperature rises in some parts of Africa that are more than, you know, we say that the global temperature has increased by about 1 degree, but in some parts of Africa and different locations on the planet, that can be an increase of already 4 or 5 degrees on average between what it was 50, 60 years ago. So the impacts are really intense and will be felt across the board.
And does the report look mainly at the kind of the direct impacts, or are you exploring secondary impacts such as migration and the implications that this might have as well?
Yeah, no, we don't explore secondary impacts because basically we stick to the scientific basis as much as possible. But you know, obviously, like you can use it as a guide to where you will see impacts. For instance, amongst the most vulnerable, we find countries like Afghanistan and Somalia. These are countries that we know are already suffering severely from violence and conflict and very difficult socio-political situations. And these countries are going to be hammered by climate change with exponential stresses over the coming years. Agriculture in Afghanistan is more than 50% of the GDP, almost the entire workforce of the country. Compares to like 1 to 2% of GDP in most wealthy countries. So the impacts of climate change in economic terms, for instance, are felt most in the agricultural sector. So in countries like, I don't know, Spain, which is quite badly affected, but the agricultural sector is just 3% of GDP. So the harm is limited. Whereas in a place like Afghanistan, the harm will obliterate literally the economy potentially if measures aren't taken. So yeah.
And what do you hope the report will achieve? Obviously, it provides kind of a lot of data, and it's going to be really useful to people investigating these. Do you think it's going to? Do you think it could provide a platform that helps people empathise or that helps mobilise people? And that might not be its goal, but like, does this kind of data, does communicating this kind of information help mobilise people? Do you think, or is something else needed in addition?
Well, lots of other things are probably needed in addition, but I think it's supposed to help. I think it's a wake up. It's a wake up. I mean, I don't think I would expect that most people, if you ask them, do you know that climate change kills already 350,000 people in the world? I would think that most people don't know that. This knowledge is not actually that recent. I mean, the WHO has been studying that stuff since the 1990s, and others have the knowledge base is quite good, but it's not been disseminated. And I think if you were to ask people, do you know that the types of, the way our economy is structured and the types of energy we're using, that is resulting in deaths in other countries, I think people would be quite upset about that. And it's not just the things that affect people in other countries. For the very reason that the United States is actually very badly affected, for instance, or we estimate that right now about $150 billion a year has been removed from a global economy in a recession. This is removing value from everybody. Just like the downturn happened to a very small financial sector in one part of the world has affected the rest of the world. So what happens in climate change also affects everybody, and I think people are not aware about that. I mean, public understanding of climate change itself is ridiculously small. I mean, the scientific consensus on climate change is 97%, basically. That compares with 50% of the general public's belief worldwide, 38% in the United States that think that scientists even are in agreement on climate change. So, I mean, these are massive issues of awareness and understanding that we need to correct. And so, I think part of correcting that is supplying information about what is exactly happening. The report is also trying to address policies that are not really accurate enough in reaching the most vulnerable communities at the moment. There's gaps in the way, I mean, adaptation is already actually taking place, only tiny amounts of adaptation, but there are billions of dollars of funds that have been pledged to go into adaptation over the next coming years. And that's still inadequate, especially on the basis of our analysis, but the way that money is looking to be spent at the moment doesn't match up with the impacts that we're seeing. For instance, very little spending in health, almost nothing, 1% so far, 3% of what is planned, depending on how you look at it. So basically the 350,000 people that will die every year, that will continue to be the case as we stand.
We just mentioned the importance of disseminating this information. Where can people access the report?
So the report can be accessed on our website, which is, so our organization is DARA. The website is daraint.org, daraint.org, and it can be found there.
Excellent. Okay, well, I encourage our viewers to go and have a look. And Matthew, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much.